I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, my topic is Ideology is Everything. I'm going to talk about myths of superiority in religion, politics, and mass formation. And to do this, I'm going to be mentioning Tessa Lena, Jack Sirius, Joe Atwill, Robert Malone, and Jim Reagan, and then ending with Scott Adams and Guttermouth, one of my favorite Substack blogs. Let's get started. I have often said that there's only one disagreement that any argument I have ever been in boils down to, which is whether we are superior to other people. I was having a wonderful, beautiful conversation about this on Tessa Lena's Substack, on, of all things, a post on Gnosticism. And we were talking about whether you can tell people that you think their beliefs are wrong and why, and whether you should. And if you do, how do you do that? This is not only these days about the things you don't talk about in polite company of religion and politics, but the third rail of all social interactions is now the COVID dilemma and all of the things associated with it. So that has added a layer where I think this is the biggest discussion that we can be having is what is the ideology, and can you, should you, and how do you challenge someone else's ideology? Because this was on Tessa's post on Gnosticism, I mentioned that a reader of mine, Jack Sirius, who I think may be the best read person that I know, had read Joe Atwill's book and was also talking about Gnosticism. This happened to be on a thread on my Robert Malone video because I mentioned in that thread that the person who had confirmed my suspicions about Robert Malone and had given me the courage to go public with them was Joe Atwill. When I looked up Robert Malone on my friend's Wikispooks, the only suspicion was listed as Joe Atwill. And since that happened to be someone that I knew from 12 years prior, I thought of him as one of the greatest conspiracy researchers that I know because he is dealing with the original. So I contacted him, and that was something that allowed me to say, I'm going to go ahead and talk about this. So because that was on a different thread, Jack didn't remember that I had recommended Joe Atwill and that was why he read Caesar's Messiah. So he thought maybe I was his own personal controlled opposition and my AI surveillance had just figured that out. When we straighten it out, though, here's what he wrote about Joe Atwill's book. Now that it's cleared up with regard to Caesar's Messiah, Atwell had me at hello. But that's because his conclusions seem rather obvious, once clearly stated, to anyone who's ever studied the early history of Gnosticism, especially the suppression of Gnosticism that continues to this day by the previously blatantly named Roman Catholic Church. However, his scholarship was impressive and, to me at least, definitive. I don't believe in settled science or history, but his scholarship approaches that mark, which for me probably means that it articulates my own previous unarticulated sensibility. In the same comment, Jack says that ever since reading my book, which he did at the same time as reading David Graeber's The Dawn of Everything, he's wanted to thank me for showing the origins of democracy as a defense of empire and the anathematization of anarchism. He says that ever since he's read that, it's continued to inform his personal political thinking. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we look at the political, that when we're challenging someone else's politics, we're not challenging them as a person. What we're challenging is their defense of empire thinking. And empire thinking is always has that seduction of we are superior. When I mentioned this to Tessa in our conversation, she said that she had also read Joe Atwill's Caesar's Messiah because I mentioned it. And she was now on the second book of his. So now I have to reconsider who the best read person I know is. In that conversation, what we're looking at is can you, should you, and how do you challenge someone else's belief system? The reason that I feel it's important is the same reason that Jack points to in talking about democracy, that when we defend a religion that is secretly on the side of the empire, but pretending to be on the side of sovereignty, then what we're doing is falling for a manipulation. As I've talked about in several other episodes, there are only 3 possibilities for reality. The first one is God is a monster. The second is there is no God. And the third is there is no world. Let's unpack that. Let's look at God as a monster. In all of the institutional religions, certainly the Abrahamic religions, we have a concept of a creator God who made the world and pain and death and suffering, and who has the ability to intervene in it. So when someone feels secure through their religion, and their religion gives them hope, what are they really saying? They know that bad things happen to other people. And the only way that they could feel safe that those things won't happen to them is if what they believe in is a selective God, a God who prefers some over others. And that, I think, is the empire thinking. That's why I believe that Christianity is a tool that fits exactly into the hand of the empire and was designed by the empire. And then we have the belief system that there is no God, which does seem like it assumes that we are equal, but it's based on Darwin's survival of the fittest. And I've already talked about what a snob Darwin was. So that again is based on this myth of superiority. So the only way that I can see the possibility that a God would exist, that meaning, purpose, truth, reality would exist, all being the words for the same thing, is if the world is not the way that we see it. And that's what I talked about on the last episode. I'm putting this episode on the playlist Politics is Division because I think that's one of the most obvious to be able to see. We couldn't be pitted against each other, Democrats, Republicans in the United States, if there wasn't a sense that we don't just agree on a couple of ideas that we think are better than somebody else's ideas. We think we're better people. Otherwise, you would be questioning why is almost half the country voting for this other person. You wouldn't be denigrating them. And when we look at global politics, war is only possible by the belief that some people are superior to others. And we can only be looking at colonization through that same lens. So I think that kind of empire thinking goes throughout, and we can test it by reversing everything that we look at, the way that Caitlin Johnstone does in a recent article looking at the U.S. surrounding China, and how if China was to be doing the same thing to the US, we would be seeing that as an act of aggression. Now I want to go to the meat of this episode, which is looking at the question of mass formation. The reason that this ideology matters so much is because it's been described as a chicken or egg discussion, that we all agree that there are people who are creating and taking advantage of this situation through COVID and the vaccines and global domination even. And we all agree that there's something strange going on with people, that they can't see it, even though it's in front of their eyes. So it's not the phenomenon that we are in disagreement about. What we're looking at is which came first. And the reason that's important is because we're looking at cause. Which is cause and which is effect. If the cause is human nature, essentially, and their desire to be led, then it's a problem that is pretty much insoluble. But if the cause is empire and the system that empire built, and that's not even really to say specific people, because of course we've all grown up within this way of empire and this competition. So the fact that some people who have succeeded at it would now be in a position to do this final consolidation, which is what I believe is happening, that makes sense. And they don't have to be outside of that system, but it's the system, it's not human nature. So Jim Reagan has written an article called On the Psychology of Totalitarianism, and I want to look at that in depth. Jim starts his post with a quote from Dr. Robert Malone. As we approach 2023, you are now completing and have survived the third year of the largest, most globally coordinated psychological warfare operation in the history of mankind. During this period, on a daily basis, you have experienced the U.S. government and many Western nations deploying highly refined military-grade fifth-generation warfare technologies against their own citizens. I agree completely with that statement. Robert Malone posted that on December 12th, so after my first video and before the second, but it seems like there are other things that he said which contradict it. Matt Arrett has posted a video called Why is Robert Malone Pushing Anti-China Misinformation? And what he says is that Robert Malone has stated that anyone calling out controlled opposition is only demonstrating that they themselves are the controlled opposition used willfully or not by intelligence agencies to discredit the resistance. Sounds fine, but what if he's pushing misinformation, willfully or no? And so he looks at how Dr. Malone is asserting that COVID was released in order to destroy Western civilization as a bioweapon to kill millions in a war which is being done by China against the U.S. What makes Jim's analysis so close to my own heart is that it's based on logic, and logic is my superpower. That doesn't look at all at the personality of Desmond and is there anything intentional going on with this. It just looks at the ideas and holds them up to scrutiny. The point that Jim makes is that where Desmond looks at people rushing into their chains and being afraid and therefore believing whatever was told to them, doesn't take into account the level of censorship and surveillance. And if we had actually been able to tell the truth to each other, even if the mainstream media was giving a different narrative, had we been able to talk to each other, the results would have been different. Jim writes, "We're told that during the COVID crisis, we all acted out a pressing psychological need for certainty and thus believed the numbers put out by health agencies throughout the world." It says, "We have called the misery that has been so dramatized in the mass media down on ourselves to a large extent." How? Because we believe the numbers given to us. We believe the data. And the reason we believe the numbers and the data is because we've been captured by and put our blind faith in the mechanistic world of science. Now that's according to the psychology of totalitarianism. And then Jim talks about ontology, the branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being. And he asks, did this mechanistic thinking really exist before we were bombarded with all this? There's another part that I would add, which is that in Matthias's book, there's some way in which, although we were all subjected to the same thing, we all have the same human nature, some of us were able to see through it. So I think it relies once again on that empire thinking, which is not saying, okay, I happen to be in a position where the vaccine wasn't necessary for me to keep a job, and therefore I didn't need to justify it in retrospect. Those are things that I think we need to be looking at, not just the censorship and the surveillance, but also economics and how economics have played into this to create cognitive dissonance between decisions that we were forced to make, coerced to make, and then the beliefs that we have had afterwards. While I was in the process of making this video, a reader named Reggie Vanderveen suggested that I read John Waters' Unchained in his new Substack, which is The Psychology of a Hatchet Job. By a hatchet job, he's referring to the article Mass Formation or Mass Atrocity. So this is a couple of things from it. One might imagine then that Matthias Desmet would be venerated throughout the freedom movement, and to a degree he is. But there has also been this recurring pattern of denigration and misrepresentation, ultimately suggesting itself as rooted in envy or something more sinister. The tendency has not merely been to question his analysis, a valid exercise and one he welcomes and enters into wholeheartedly and without rancor when it occurs, but to discredit him and, it often seems, take him down. More worrying is that the criticism has frequently been accompanied by grotesque insinuations concerning his motives and loyalties. This has seemed not merely gratuitous and unhelpful to the wider effort, but makes no sense either in its granular content or in yielding up any possible motive that is not malign. He says the review is 15,000 words long, but it might just be a tweet, for it has the character and integrity of a shit post of 240 characters. Its approach, as with previous attacks on Desmet, is to twist and corrupt his statements and meanings to create a certain impression that he is seeking to use his understanding of the psychological dynamics of totalitarianism to get the evildoers off the hook. Now, it seems to me that John Waters throughout refers to these three authors as the Troika, and that seems to be doing the very thing that he's accusing the detractors of Desmet of doing, making more of a character assassination rather than looking at the actual logic. Towards the end, John Waters says that the truth is crisply conveyed in a couple of citations, and this is one. Is there not any steering and manipulation at all then? The answer is a resounding yes. There most certainly is all kinds of manipulation. And with the means available to today's mass media, the possibilities are simply phenomenal. Such steering, however, is primarily not a steering by individuals. The most fundamental steering is impersonal in nature. The steering is first and foremost driven by an ideology, a way of thinking. Ideologies organize and structure society progressively and organically. So, the invitation that I'd like to give Reggie and others is that I'll link to both Jim's and John's articles in my Substack, and I'd like to talk about where do the differences between these lead? What's the solution that either of them offers? My concern with Desmet's analysis is that it doesn't leave much of anywhere to go, because if it's an ideology that's organic, I don't know how you change that. If we look at this being more the brigands and the global predators, that there are psychopaths who are utilizing this, then that would say if we can get those psychopaths out of power, everything will change. I don't personally know if that's true. What I look at is systems and say that rather than predators, what we have are parasites. And with parasites, if you can take the host away from them, they will starve. And so my solutions look at how do we take our communities and our economies and our sustenance away where they cannot be leached away by the parasites. And that, to me, is where I think we're best served in terms of putting our energy, not towards arguing either of these. And I will end with Guttermouth and the art of the backhanded apology, I'm sorry you're an asshole. So Guttermouth is so funny, but most of you have probably already seen the Scott Adams video, the author of Dilbert, who says, you win. You anti-vaxxers who went with your gut feeling of don't trust government, don't trust pharmaceuticals. I just want to say it clearly. You win. I lose. You win. All my analysis, it didn't get me as far as your following your gut paranoia got you. And so I was going to mention that anyway, but she does a much funnier job of it. So I will link to that and show why that is not the hashtag I was wrong that I talk about wanting to see go viral, but instead is this way where it's looking more at I was smarter than you, and now I just have to admit that, you guys, stupid as you are, ended up making the right decision. That is not, as we all know, the case. And even if we did make the right decision on the vaccines, as Visceral Adventures points out, no one is winning. To follow this up, I'm going to suggest 6 levels of reality on Jeremy Gilbert and truth-telling in a time of catastrophe. Thank you for being a part of my conversation.